You've probably heard things like the issues are in your tissues and the body keeps the score. But what does that mean? How do things get stuck in the body? Where are they in your tissues? And perhaps most importantly, how do we release them? Today, we're going to look at connective tissue, also known as fascia, and I'll use those terms interchangeably. And we're going to look at how issues can get stuck in your connective tissue, in particular, how stress and emotion can get trapped in the webbing of your body, and then also how to release it, which is going to lead to some interesting conversation about nervous system calibration. I started studying connective tissue because I was experiencing things in my body that could not be explained by the model of the musculoskeletal system. This is exactly what led many body workers to explore fascia and push science forward in terms of studying fascia and connective tissue. And what I felt more specifically was I was in revolved side angle pose, Parvrita Parsvakonasana, and I was feeling that X of connective tissue across my back. And I was like, what is that? There's no muscle that goes that direction or connects those different parts. There has to be something more. And so I went searching and studying connective tissue. And what I found surprised me because it was much bigger than just, oh, it's another thing in the body. When I look at connective tissue, it actually requires a whole different paradigm of thinking, which will be a different presentation because it asks you to see wholeness and connection. And I feel like most of yoga was built around that principle, but as it got brought to the West, we started to use the biomechanical model. But yoga makes way more sense when you look at it from this lens of connective tissue, because again, you're working with the principle of wholeness and connectivity. Fascia also makes sense out of pain, chronic tightness, and this boomerang phenomena I would see with clients, where they would feel great during a session, they'd have release, they'd have opening, they'd have better alignment, but then it's like the body would boomerang, slingshot back into its old shape and structure. And then they'd be in pain or more pain, or they wouldn't be able to hold the positive alignment. So connective tissue, it's almost like it can pull muscles back into old positions, pull posture back into old habits. And this is something that's echoed in the bodywork schools. Fascia also gives you a new relationship to your body, another barometer on your dashboard for inner listening, because as you're going to see, it has many different responsibilities in the body. Some people will say it's like a second nervous system. And one anatomist said, if you think about your central nervous system like a train track, then fascia is like a slick, wet jungle. And I spent time living on Maui, and I remember once we went on a hike in the rain, in the jungle, and it was so alive. And that's what fascia is like. It is teeming with aliveness. This aliveness is what made fascia so hard to study. At the time of death, it collapses. It is different in a living body than in a corpse. And this makes me think of prana, mana, and chi, that there is this undefinable, unmeasurable, yet distinctly recognizable quality of aliveness, and it seems to show up in our connective tissue. You can see that your connective tissue is a vital part of your internal environment, both how you sense your internal environment and how your internal environment is expressed through your body. Your connective tissue is constantly remodeling. It's responding to your posture, your movement. It contracts, it can stiffen with stress. It can even become inflamed, but it can also cleanse and clear itself when you work to release it. So how do issues get stuck in your connective tissue? We're going to look at myofascial interoception, how a dysregulated nervous system can create persistent muscle and fascia holding patterns, how fear and chronic stress can lead to inflammation, and also how memory is not like a memory of your mind, but it's the memory in your body. The holding, bracing, gripping, moving, or breathing pattern that you have that may not even be conscious, may not even be developed in your lifetime, but how it becomes a part of our living, breathing system. Myofascial interoception is a concept developed by Bruno Bordini, and they see fascia as an emotional regulatory tissue. And part of the reason they're able to draw this conclusion is that 80 to 90% of its nerve endings are interoceptive. and that we shift in structure, how we're holding our body in response to our internal state. And that makes sense. Think of how you hold your body when you're scared or you're sad versus when you're happy and you're joyful or when you're anxious. Where do you hold your stress? When stuff starts to get kicked up inside of you, I bet you have a very specific biological response. It may be a pit in your stomach. It may be nausea. It may be a clenching in your jaw. But we hold stress somewhere, and it's unlikely it started with you. And this is part of the way the issues get stuck in our tissues. Now, if you think of emotions as energy in motion, and if that energy in motion isn't allowed to pass through, it gets stuck somewhere, then it can settle and create like a blockage in the tissue. Now, this sounds super woo-woo, but bear with me, because we hear things like the issues in your tissues, the body keeps the score, but we're not often asking how. And as soon as we ask how, we have to start looking at the nervous system and things we're not processing, or things that are creating a dysregulated state. And sometimes if we don't feel things all the way, it's like they get stuck in the body and they create more of that dysregulated state. And something like feel your feelings is not all that helpful, because a lot of times people will think their feelings rather than actually feel them. Feeling them requires you identify where in your body something is bubbling up for you, that pit in your stomach, that clenching of your jaw, that lump in your throat. And rather than thinking about it, trying to dissect it, why is it happening? How do I get rid of it? How do I run from it? How do I shut it down? Or how do I vomit it out on someone? Instead, you're just feeling that lump in your throat. And that's being present with what is, being attuned to the body. And again, not thinking. Your mind will try to pull you out of it. When I've done this, which isn't easy because that sensation can actually become overwhelming, but then it gets to a point where it literally dissipates. It's like a bubble popping or like dust being blown off your system or out of your body. But if you take the time to explore and experiment with this, it's much more concrete, less woo-woo. But you have to get out of the mind, stop thinking about it, identify it inside of your body, which is an interoceptive practice, and then sit with it long enough to become familiar with it and allow that energy to be released. Also note that your tissue adapts to repeated patterns. Whether that's sitting in a chair all day working on the computer, your tissue will adapt and mold to that shape, or whether it's constantly holding tension in your belly, in your throat, in your jaw, your tissue will adapt to that state. And then it can start to set the nervous system cycle in motion, because that tension can create a fear response or a stress response. So then the state of your body starts to trigger the nervous system, and then that triggers the body more. It becomes one of those vicious cycles versus a virtuous cycle. And that vicious cycle is going to create chronic dysregulation, which is going to affect the brainstem below conscious thought and create a cascade of maladaptive responses. Because remember that the brainstem below conscious thought is organizing things in your body like heart rate, blood pressure, digestive functions. So dysfunction there creates this cascade of these different bodily functions. And what happens is we usually end up with a hyper response or a hypo response, an overactive of something or an underactive of something or many things. And then we end up with weird symptoms like gastrointestinal issues, autoimmune conditions, or even like diffuse pain that's kind of bouncing around the body, or chronically achy conditions like fibromyalgia. Let's apply this more specifically to connective tissue. With chronic dysregulation, with emotional stress, fear, anxiety, a neurochemical called TGF-beta is released, stimulating collagen production and creating cross-linking, more laying down of connective tissue, which means we have denser and less elastic fascia. So think of that tightness in your jaw being this cross-linking, this holding, this denser fascia that then keeps you stuck in that physiological response and potentially in that nervous system state. Similar with the lump in your throat, the knot in your belly, that constant tightness in your lower back that leads to it going out, which is really a misfiring of the core muscles and like a traffic jam that occurs and everything goes offline. So these patterns we have in our tissues can be built up because of our nervous system, and then again, they reinforce the nervous system state. So the next question becomes, how do you release it? I have 3 strategies for you. One is well-tensioned movement. Well-tensioned movement begins with your core, and not six-pack abs core, but intra-abdominal pressure core. And that begins with a stacking of the rib cage and the pelvis. When you have that stacking of the rib cage and pelvis, the respiratory diaphragm, pelvic floor diaphragm can move in tandem, and this creates a container, this tightness being taut like a drum of the abdominal fibers, and then everything else starts to line up. Then you're less likely to have tension in your psoas, in your glutes, in your chest, in your throat, because you're compensating for this lack of stability in your core. So that core is the foundation for well-tensioned movements. And then when you're reaching or stretching, like extending one arm, opposite leg, it's like the whole body becomes strung like an instrument. And there's a hum, a resonance that happens there. Hard to describe with words, but it is profoundly healing. Number 2 is myofascial release, either self-myofascial release with foam rollers, balls. You can even use like 𝐸𝐺𝐵𝐺, or with a professional, a rolfer or structural integration. There's many, many different types of bodywork schools that work on connective tissue, and they're very, very, very powerful. The third way is somatic practices. This is like the slidey-glidey movement that we do. Feldenkrais, Thomas Hanna's work. I learned it from T.S. Little and his Satya method. But at the beginning of almost every practice we do some type of releasing work, either myofascial release work and or somatic releasing work, usually both. And what it does is it like cleanses the body. It's like shaking the 𝐬𝐻 so you have a clean palette to work with. Releasing patterns in your connective tissue takes time. Some of these patterns will be generations old. They're deeply held. And so working with them will take patience, perseverance, and it's almost like working with a Rubik's Cube, that once you work one thing out, something else usually pops up over here. And that doesn't mean that something's wrong. It usually means that things are going very, very right. And remember that fascia is like a web. So if you pull on one string, of course it affects other things. What does this mean for practice? Understanding fascia, connective tissue, gives you a new lens for looking at your body and your movement patterns. It's another way to heal and to access your inner awareness. And note that so many of the fibers of connective tissue are for interoception, inner awareness. And note that when we study the nervous system and healing trauma or getting out of depression or working with overwhelm, there's an interoceptive component. And we see with any type of nervous system dysregulation that one of the things that is lacking is an interoceptive ability. And then most of the things that create healing are reestablishing that inner network, that inner listening and inner awareness. And fascia is another way to get that, to work with that, to build that relationship with your body. And then you can also explore and address pain, imbalance, and asymmetry. Questions to ask yourself: where do you hold your stress? When did it start? And it may not even start with you. And then how can you release it? Where do you notice it releasing? What is effective? One of the things that has consistently surprised me over the years of practice is I have tension and holding patterns I don't even see. They're like blind spots. And it's only by exploring and experimenting that I discover them. A good example is years ago, I was rolling my head on the block is when I started doing that work. And I realized that if I didn't consciously release, I was always holding my head a little bit off the block. And then that releasing into the block, it was like a sigh for the back of my skull. And there's a lot of connective tissue there. And then I was able to keep the head heavy in other somatic releasing movements, like what we call the unraveling twist. Here's how you know it's alive inside of you. You become attuned and skillful in responding to the stress inside of your body. You can sense the issues in your tissues. Your pain decreases, nociceptors. Your balance increases, proprioceptors. Your capacity to bear load, to move gracefully, especially under load, increases, mechanoreceptors. And your calibration, your ability to navigate your nervous system becomes better, chemoreceptors. you have a whole new pathway and paradigm for inner exploration. If you like this, please subscribe and share. Your viewership, your participation keeps us creating. Awareness of fascia and connective tissue is humming in the background of all the practices I create. Some of my favorites in the 20-Minute Miracle Toolkit are Wonderwall, the windmill, and sitting bone strength.